that that show that we did on the all alternative. Thank you and welcome to the show today. The topic this morning is Dr. MLK Martin Luther King Jr. and the war on poverty 50 years later. And we're fortunate to have with us to talk about the history in a real sense of the war on poverty, Dr. Baldwin. And of course, Dr. Baldwin, you've been with us.
Oh man, yeah.
You've just been with us.
Thank you. We've been together
and
a
so
long
I don't think
time.
that there's anything that I could say in terms of trying to, because no matter whether they saw us once or 1,000 times, more than likely they saw you with us. And I say that, Dr. Baldwin, because you bring such excellent information in reference to what we're talking about here at this station. And so let's have you to start off by giving us some information in reference to your background, education, and that kind of information for the first 5 or 6 minutes.
Okay.
Then we'll come back and we'll have that second segment, and then we'll talk about poverty. As you indicated, this is the 50th anniversary of the war on poverty. We've been warring on poverty for the last 50 years officially in a real sense, because we designated it originally as what? The war on poverty. And so we've been waging war on poverty for the last 50 years. And things really, things have gotten better in many, because it's where we started from. That's why they're so better. When you start from slavery, everything that happens beyond slavery is an improvement. You see, but let's talk about it from that perspective.
Well, I grew up in Camden, Alabama, Wilcox County, Alabama, the so-called Alabama Black Belt, and I actually grew up in poverty, and I was educated in the public schools of Camden, Alabama, which was segregated at that time, 1955 to up roughly 1963. I was in elementary and junior high school, and in 1967, I graduated from Camden Academy High School, and from there, 1967 to 71, Talladega College in Talladega, Alabama. From there, I matriculated at Crozer Theological Seminary in Rochester, New York, graduating with an MA and a Master of Divinity in Theology in 1973 and 1975. And in 1980, I received a PhD in American religion from Northwestern University. But I became interested in Dr. King's ideas about poverty in the 1960s when I was really in high school, because he talked a lot about poverty, and I grew up in poverty. I was the son of a housewife and an uneducated Baptist preacher who had 4 churches, and who worked at the sawmill stacking lumber and was also a farmer. So my father was tri-vocational, trying to make a life for his family.
We know many of us.
So I would say that my interest in Dr. King's ideas about poverty stemmed back to the 1960s when I was in high school and the civil rights movement had started, and I realized that, hey, he's talking about us. Because you're talking about people who are struggling to make ends meet, the least of these, as Dr. King called them. So I became interested in his ideas about poverty, and when I went to college, of course, I read more about Dr. King and understood that this problem of poverty was a major component of his civil rights agenda. he was very interested, and a lot of people don't realize that. They think of him in terms of his fight for basic civil constitutional rights, the right to vote, but very few realize that he had...
It went way back.
Beyond that.
Into the cotton fields.
Exactly. To look at these people who were the least of these in the cotton fields, in the sawmills, and he was actually fighting for economic justice and the elimination of poverty.
Very good. And so in a real sense, after this 50-year war on poverty, we still find that poverty is as entrenched in a real sense as ever. Now, I think as we've indicated, things have gotten better.
Yeah.
We got a black president, we had a black president,
exactly.
et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly.
And a large number of individuals have moved up. The two of us have moved up in a real sense. But nevertheless, that same poverty that Africans, that people struggle with all poor people. You didn't have to be black to be faced with poverty. All you had to do was to be an American and not have a way out.
And the resources that others had. And a lot of people fail to realize that Dr. King's struggle against poverty was never a race-based movement. He always said that there were poor whites as well. There were poor Hispanics, poor people of all races, and
Let's take this second commercial break, and we'll be back with the audience following this very, very short commercial break.
Of his dream.
Okay, that sounds good. That's good. Yeah, that's good. I like that first segment. Yeah, I like that.
I tried to connect the personal with it because, I grew up in poverty.
Hey, who didn't? Most of us did.
I'm the oldest.
And especially if you graduated after the late 60s and early 70s from one of these white educational institution of higher education, more than likely you got there primarily because you were poverty-stricken and got caught in some kind of educational program that allowed you to go to these institutions and get those degrees and et cetera, and et cetera. We all know, we all grew up.
All knew about that.
I'm from a cotton-picking
family.
Now,
where are you from?
I'm from Arkansas.
Yeah,
Hope, Arkansas.
Hope?
That's right.
Hope. I've been there.
I was as poor in Hope as Bill Clinton was in Hope.
Look at me, the oldest of 12 kids.
That's right. Thank you, and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. Lewis Baldwin, and the topic is the war on poverty 50 years later. And so, Doctor, let's pick up during the second segment and give you an opportunity to expand dealing with this war on poverty, and then we'll deal with some solutions during the final segment.
Yeah, the war on poverty as defined by Dr. King. A lot of people don't realize that Dr. King was interested in economic justice issues from the time of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955-56. If you remember the bus boycott, he was calling upon blacks to use their power as consumers to force the bus companies to integrate. And of course, from that point, he focused mostly on basic civil constitutional rights, the right to vote. But in 1966, when he went to Chicago, he began to take this issue of poverty and economic justice more seriously. If you recall, when he went to Chicago in January of 1966, he went there to fight slum conditions and also to force real estate agents to cease their practices of discrimination. Discrimination in real estate practices. He's very concerned about that. So that was actually the beginnings of his serious war on poverty in Chicago in 1966. Running up against the Daley machine, Mayor Richard J. Daley, and the power structure in Chicago, he was fighting for the education of slum dwellers, for the organization of slum dwellers, also for the beginnings of a kind of poor people's Campaign. A lot of people associate that with Memphis and the Poor People's Campaign as it was planned by SCLC later in 1967, but it actually began in 1966. And then after 1966, 1967, Dr. King and SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, began to plan a Poor People's Campaign because they realized that even if people had access to hotels and other accommodations, if you don't have the economic resources, what good is it?
You know, Dr. Baldwin, that became important because when we moved from the rural South, picking cotton, sawmills, and et cetera,
that's right,
going north, it was a belief that things would get better for Africans.
That's right.
But nevertheless, once we arrived in the north, we found that the so-called ghetto, you see, which is to say that we were separated in the South. But we were not separated in the South as we were separated in the North. And so poverty.
And the economic deprivation of people was in many cases more intense in the North.
Very good.
And Dr. King realized that when he went to Chicago to become a part of the Chicago Freedom Movement in 1966. So it begins there, and in 1967, he and SCLC began to plan the first large-scale demonstration of the Civil Rights era, which was the Poor People's Campaign.
That's right.
It spilled over from 1967 into 68. And in the course of that movement, he got involved in the Memphis sanitation strike, if you recall, fighting for sanitation workers. There were a lot of people in SCLC didn't think that he should go to Memphis. But he went there because he felt that the sanitation strike was really an extension of what he was about in terms of the planning of this Poor People's Campaign. So he was all about poverty and economic injustice, a radical redistribution of economic resources. He was concerned about health care, about education for slum dwellers, and also about getting rid of what he called this syndrome of deprivation, which is associated with slum life and economic insecurity. So Dr. King made economic justice, poverty, a part of that last crusade of the Civil Rights Movement. That's what he was about, aside from this question of international peace. But he was very concerned about economic justice, bringing about economic justice.
Public accommodation meant absolutely nothing if you did not have the opportunity to go to the restaurant.
Exactly. Public accommodations, public access meant nothing. If you don't have the money to rent a room in a hotel, if you don't have the money to eat at a restaurant, what good is access to public accommodation?
And it was always assumed that once Africans left the rural South and went to the North, where there were buildings and indoor toilets and et cetera, that we had overcome. We had overcome one aspect of poverty, but we had not overcome the economic aspects.
Exactly,
Is that what we're saying?
You're talking about something that was deeply entrenched in the structures and institutions of this country. And Dr. King realized that, and he felt that the African Americans in the North were no different from whites and African Americans in the South. Because if you remember, the South was the most poverty-stricken area of the country, and it was not just blacks, it was whites also.
More so, because numerically they made up a larger number.
Exactly, and King's movement was really, this Poor People's Campaign was about bringing together blacks and poor whites and Appalachian whites and Native Americans and Hispanic Americans. It was really a sort of rainbow coalition to try to dramatize the problems of poverty and economic injustice before the nation.
Dr. Baldwin, I tell you, this we're getting ready for this second commercial break, but this information, I'm just pulling this information together and to demonstrate that Africans who were in the South picking cotton were discriminated against as well as Africans who were in the North, even though it was better to leave the South, the all the migratory movements from the South to the North indicated that there was something better up there. But once we got there, the situation was just...
It was not the promised land, as Dr. King said. We're still in search of the promised land, and hopefully we can deal with that in the third segment. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, well, I certainly can appreciate that because it makes a lot of sense, and all the things that we are talking about, this is traced in my own personal history
and your own pilgrimage.
And I think we all made those when we went off to these institutions in the northern parts of the United States, and we saw things a little different, but we still remembered what it was like there, and then we saw the difference there. Up there, it was not, as you indicated, the promised land.
Exactly.
As we thought it would
we
be.
are all products of this affirmative action program that Dr. King had so much involvement in bringing about.
That's right.
Affirmative action was very much a part of this economic program that he had in mind.
Where would we be today had there not been an affirmative action program?
I think it's unimaginable for me, you know, because,
I know it is for me.
Because so many people got education, so many in our community.
We're going to take this last commercial break, and we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break.
In terms of the fulfillment of Dr. King's dream.
That's right.
You know, because that dream has not been fulfilled.
That's right. And it's a powerful dream, too.
Homelessness and economic.
It speaks toward equality.
And if you look at what Trump, people he's appointed to his cabinet are billionaires and millionaires.
Man. Can you imagine that?
How are they expected to address the issues of the poor? You can't do it. It's like putting rich man divers on the Lazarus
that's right.
food bank,
That's right.
making him the head of the It ain't gonna work.
I tell you, this is strange. But everything that you said, it's all right.
Yeah, but if you look at this cabinet, man, it's billionaires and millionaires.
Can you imagine? I don't see how the American people can stand for
how
that.
did divers respond to Lazarus?
Oh, man.
He begged, and he didn't give him anything.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly it.
And it's a
Thank you, and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. Lewis Baldwin, and the topic is the war on poverty 50 years later. And now, Doctor, let's see if we can use this final segment to look at some of the solutions. I think that we've already indicated that affirmative action was a solution.
Exactly.
The marches, all of these were solutions for poverty at that particular time.
Yeah.
But now we are in a different time period, a different age, and now we need some new solutions and new directions.
Exactly.
And so, as Dr. King gave directions at his time, as a scholar, give us some directions in which
Now, Dr. King, before he left us, he made a trip to the Scandinavian countries. He visited Sweden and Denmark and Norway and received the Nobel Prize in Norway. And he noticed that democratic socialism was at work. There was universal health care. Every able-bodied person had a job. There was a guaranteed income for every family. There was universal education. And interestingly enough, we have not achieved that in this country. Dr. King set forth this as a dream, that we need universal education, that we need universal health care, that we need a job for every able-bodied person, that we need the nationalization of basic industries to make sure that discrimination does not take place, that we need a guaranteed income for every American family. Unfortunately, we haven't come very far in terms of the realization of that dream. Because if you look at today, there's pervasive homelessness, much more homelessness than there was in the 1960s, if I'm not mistaken. 20 million more people have health care, primarily because of the Affordable Care Act, but that...
And they're trying to do away with that.
They're trying to get rid of that. Exactly. And we have to understand that the whole war on poverty had to do with getting health care, the availability of health care for the poor. And unfortunately, that's under attack now. Homelessness is pervasive, and of course, there's little in the way of education for people who are slum dwellers. both President Johnson and Dr. King felt that that was very, very important, because you had to get rid of this syndrome of deprivation and victimization among the poor. So I think we have a long way to go as we look back 50 years to the Poor People's Campaign with Dr. King, and as we look back 50 years to the initiatives of President Johnson and the Congress as it related to equal economic opportunity. We have not fulfilled those promises. You know, remember President Johnson had this ideal of the Great Society. And the Great Society was about economic opportunity. Dr. King had this idea of the beloved community, which was about economic egalitarianism, and we have not achieved that. So one of the major questions before us as we face the next presidential administration is, where will we go in terms of the fulfillment of this dream of economic equality, the elimination of poverty? And I have serious questions about where we are going from here.
Well, Dr. Baldwin, think in terms of identifying some individuals that you know through your scholarship or whatnot who might be on the forefront of making us recognize that the 50 years that went before were only the preliminary of what should happen, and therefore give us some idea as to what are people saying we ought to do, not only we as Africans, but we as Americans ought to do in order to make sure that more people have the opportunities and the privileges that we had coming out of the South as we had.
Yeah, but you don't see much of that, even in the realm of scholarship, in educational institutions, in ecclesial circles, meaning the church, of course. People are not talking about that, and that's the disturbing sign that I see today, is that not much is being said about what Dr. King called the need for a radical redistribution of economic resources, the elimination of homelessness, the providing of health care on a universal basis, education against slum conditions. You don't find people talking about that.
As a matter of fact, as you list them, it appears that there's more activity in an effort to try to prevent people from having health care, from having homes, from being in safe environments, etc. There's more of that than anything else. Instead of reaching out to help people, it seems that people are trying to, as they say, send people back to where they were.
Exactly, and the rich is getting richer and the poor poorer. And I think Dr. King, if he were alive today,